Welcome friends! In this lecture, we're going to create our first shader. Okay, now we're going to create our first shader. But before we can do that, we need to create a node so that we can attach the shader to that node. So we can create any node that's going to draw to the canvas, draw to the screen here. But the simplest one to use is going to be a sprite 2D. So let's go ahead and create a sprite 2D here. By the way, if you haven't created the project yet, there's a lecture inside of the introduction and setup section called Create the Project. If you skip that, make sure to take a look at that. That's where we created the project. Okay, so the sprite 2D is going to take a texture, so we can use the icon image here. And then I'm going to move it to the center of the screen. If you take a look at the inspector, you will see that the sprite 2D has a section called Material. And this is under Canvas Item. So any node that is a canvas item that's drawing to the screen, you can attach a shader to. There's a section here called Material, and if you click on it, you will see that it has a property called Material. We first need to create this so that we can create a shader. You have two options here if you click on empty here, a canvas item material and a shader material. You might have seen the canvas item material before. If you click on it again, you get a couple of options here like the blend mode, you can change the light mode, but there isn't much else you can do here. So now we're gonna actually use a shader material. So I'm gonna reset this by clicking on this arrow, and then I'm gonna create a shader material. And the shader material is going to allow you to create a shader. So let's click on empty here, click on new shader, and then it's gonna open up this window. In here, we need to pick a couple of things. The first thing here is the type of the shader. We have two options, a regular shader or a visual shader. For the most part in this course, we're gonna focus on regular shaders. So let's pick that. The next thing we need to pick is the mode, and we have a bunch of options here. This mode is extremely important. For 2D shaders, you need to use canvas item. For 3D shaders, you need to use spatial. We also have particles for particle shaders, sky for sky shaders in 3D, and fog used for fog volumes. These last three are a little bit more advanced. In this course, we're going to focus on canvas item shaders and spatial shaders. And in the first sections of the course, we're going to focus on 2D shaders. So this is going to be canvas item for us. There's a template we can use. We can leave that as default. We don't need to make it a built-in shader. Let's also pick a folder for this. So I want to go back one folder into the res, right click, create a new folder called shaders. And I'm going to save this shader here and I'm going to name it my first shader. Let's create it. If you take a look at the file system inside of the shaders folder, we now have a file called myfirstshader.gdshader. And shaders in Godot are basically resources, so we can save them to the file system, no problem. To open up the shader, we could either double click on this here in the file system, or we can also click on the shader here inside of the material in the inspector. And once you do that, the shader editor is going to pop up from the bottom. It's this guy right here. You can actually undock this with this button if you want to move it. But I'm just going to keep it inside of the bottom panel here. On the left side of the shader editor, we have the files. Currently, we only have a single one. If you have multiple shaders, you can pick them here. And the one you have selected will be displayed here inside of the right side of the panel. And this part here is very similar to the scripting editor. You have your code, you have, the lines with the numbers. You can type here. So extremely similar to the scripting editor. I don't even know why we can't just edit the shader in the scripting editor. I guess it's because it's not exactly a script. I don't know. Okay, so let's start talking about the shader. The first line here is the shader's type. This is the mode that we picked when we were creating the shader. And as you can see, it's set to be canvas item. So this says to Godot that this shader is for 2D. We could also type spatial here. And this shader now is a 3D shader. And if you take a look at the right side, in the inspector, The preview for the shader turns into a 3D sphere once we do this. Let me take it back to being canvas item. And as you can see now, it's a 2D rectangle. So very cool. To determine the type, we need to use the shader_type keyword and then the type's name. And at the end of the line, we need to put a semicolon. So all shaders in Godot need this as their first line. Now let's start talking about the shading language, because the shading language is an entirely new programming language that you need to learn. So that's why the first lectures of this course is going to focus on teaching the basics of the shading language. So you're going to have to be a little patient before we can start doing cool things with shaders. We need to understand how the shading language works. If you're coming from C#, this is going to be much more familiar for you. But if you're coming from GDScript, the shading language is very different. So the first thing we need to learn is semicolons. In the shading language, at the end of every statement like this one, we need to put a semicolon to finish the statement. But luckily, if you miss it, Godot will immediately warn you. And at the bottom side here, you can see that it's expecting a semicolon after the statement. So this is a very difficult mistake to make. Let's take a look at the rest of this template here that we got from Godot. You can see that we have a few functions here. In GDScript, this is how we make functions. We use the func keyword and then the name of the function. After that, we have a set of parentheses with the argument list. At the end of that, we have a colon. And on the next line, we indent the lines so that we can associate the lines with the function. And we have the code of the function after that indented appropriately. In the shading language, this is entirely different. First of all, instead of the func keyword, we have the return type of the function. So in this case, these functions don't return anything, so that's why we have void here. We're going to learn about data types in an upcoming lecture, so I'm not going to get into the different types of return types we can have here, but just know that the first part here is the return type. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this. After the return type, we have the name of the function. After that, we have a parentheses with the argument list. This is similar to GDScript. But after that, instead of a colon, we have a set of curly braces. This is how you create code blocks in the shading language. So GDScript uses indentation with tabs, but the shading language uses curly braces. So everything that's inside of these two curly braces here, everything that's here is a part of this function. And in the shading language, white space like indentation and tabs don't mean a lot. So this is a big difference compared to GDScript. For example, this curly brace here, I can take this and put it on the next line, and there is no difference. I could put it, a few lines after this declaration here, and it works just the same. So white space in the shading language is a little bit more flexible, let's say. We also have some comments here. To make a comment in the shading language, you need to use 2 forward slashes and then the comment. We have 2 here. Finally, I'm going to talk about these 2 functions here because these are special. Okay, let's get rid of these lines here. As you can see, the first one is called vertex and the second one is called fragment. We already learned about vertex and fragment shaders, and these are exactly those 2 things. The first function here is the vertex shader. So everything that's going to happen inside of this function is the vertex shader. The second one is the fragment shader, and everything that we put inside of this is the fragment shader. We also have a light function here, which is used for lighting calculations, which is a little bit more advanced, so we're not going to use this. We can get rid of it. So these are the 2 main functions that we're going to use to create the shaders we want. And these are called automatically by Godot, the vertex shader for each vertex and the fragment shader for each pixel of whatever this is attached to, in this case, the sprite 2D. Okay, I don't want to make this lecture too long. In this one, we learned how to create a shader. We first had to create a material and then the shader. And inside of the shader, we learned how the basics of the shader works, like the shader type and, semicolons and stuff like that. I don't want to make this lecture too long, so in the next one, we're going to continue exploring the shading language.